So welcome everybody. Pleased you could join us today on our S1000D compliant illustrations webinar. This is part one. We will have a part two in August. But this morning we decided to do this particular presentation. We did one about 2 years ago on S1000D compliant illustrations. And with the issue of 4.2 of the specification, we thought it'd be good to have an update. So that's really the objective of the two webinars that we're going to be doing. Just a quick, somebody just mentioned, are we recording? And the answer is yes, we are recording the webinar today. And you'll get a link to that in an email following the presentation. Just a quick agenda. We've done the introduction. We'll talk about the housekeeping rules. We'll do a company overview of Larson, and then we'll do a slide presentation, a few demos, but nothing extensive today. This is mainly the slides, summary, and then an opportunity for you to ask some questions, and then the closing information. So housekeeping, pretty standard for webinars that you've probably attended in the past. Everybody is muted for the duration of the webinar. You can ask questions via the questions panel. If you experience any problems, please put it into that panel as well. We recommend computer audio, but you can obviously join by phone if that is not if that's an issue. I'm pretty sure some of you joined by telephone today. We have a product data sheet available for one of our products that we actually show in the demo, so we thought it'd be useful just to put that up if you're interested. And you can drag and drop that onto your desktop at any time. And obviously post those questions if you have any during the presentation. If we can't answer them at the end, then we'll actually send you an email just as a follow-up. So a bit background on Larson Software. We're based in Houston, Texas, obviously the USA. We're founded back in 1984, and we've always really dealt with the graphic technology arena. So we've been doing that for over 30 years. And we developed the software mainly around the graphics arena. We provide toolkits and off-the-shelf software. We felt it was very important at the beginning to promote the CGM format and the use of CGM. We provided the VisX Reader software, which is free for viewing CGM and TIFF files, and that's still available today. And you can go to our website if you want to try it out. We're also the developer of the first HTML5 CGM viewer, where no plugin is required. This was some technology we developed over the last few years because we saw the impact of the browsers, web browsers not supporting plugins anymore. So you can also find details of that on our website. We're also a member of the CGM Open Foundation, which really administers the CGM format itself. That's a non-profit organization. We hope that our technology simplifies the graphics workflow. We provide software for technical publications. Many of you today will be professionals in that arena. But we also provide software to engineers and geologists and geophysicists in the oil and gas industry. So we're not just in aerospace and defense and automotive. We go across other industries as well. I thought it'd be nice just to introduce you to the S1000D spec if you haven't got any experience of it. I'm assuming most people do, but just a bit of background on the specification itself. Again, this was introduced back in the 1980s, believe it or not. I don't think it really took hold though until the 90s. And the main concept was to hold information in a modular form, in other words, data modules. The objective was really to create a more flexible method of managing and publishing technical documentation. So to get away from a book-based system, this monolithic book which had to be revised as a whole, and just have separate pieces of or chunks of data that could be revised independently of the whole. Today, S1000D is widely adopted and accepted globally. as a standard method of producing technical documentation, but it is in specific industries still. Because of overheads of time and so forth, I don't really see it, or it hasn't been widely adopted outside kind of big industries or defense and aerospace industries. Certainly it is used in automotive though. Graphics and multimedia are a critical component of the S1000D spec. It has its own section within the specification, and that's what we really want to discuss and show you today. So we're split into three main sections: authoring, identifying, and managing. Authoring, we're going to show or do a comparison between 4.1 and 4.2 of the spec. So I'm assuming that most people are on those issues, but the illustration rules haven't really changed all that much through those issues. But 4.2 has some new things in that we want to discuss today. Identifying is the next section, and there we'll discuss the information control number, or ICN. That chapter hasn't really been affected from 4.1 to 4.2, but I think it's still relevant if you don't know about it. It's relevant to the next section, which is brand new. It's a new chapter about the IMF, the ICN Metadata File, and this is brand new to 4.2. So that will be managing, and that will be the final part of the webinar. So first we go to authoring. I call it authoring because that's what the spec calls it. You could call it illustrating, but authoring is a more general term because you're dealing with different multimedia objects. So in the introduction part, there's some new advice, which we'll look at in a second. In the whole of the chapter, we don't cover in this particular presentation navigation and configuration. We'll cover those in part 2, and also multimedia we'll cover in part 2 as well. The e-learning and SCORM, I haven't really found anybody adopting that very much, so it's not a section that I'm going to deal with either today or in the next part of the presentation. So let's look at the introduction part of this spec. So these are some screen grabs here from the specification itself. The main thing is here, what they've done is actually split this section, this section into various sections, if that makes sense. So it was just one section, now they split it into three. So the main thing that's need to point out here is now they're actually commenting on legacy illustrations. So there was no really provision. It was all about new illustrations. So if you're creating a new project and you create new illustrations, then the guidelines are pretty clear how you need to go about that. But if you've got legacy illustrations coming from previous projects or other projects, not S1000D ones, then it wasn't very clear. But still here, the main thrust of this is they want you to maintain the commonality of the illustrations throughout the project. So they're not saying you have to fulfill everything, although the principles need to be fulfilled, but they understand that if the line weights are different, then that would be a high cost to actually change every illustration to fulfill the S1000 specification. So now there's this particular paragraph that talks about legacy illustrations. I'm not going to read it to you. I was going to zoom in on it, but I had a problem with PowerPoint this morning where it was crashing with the zoom tool. So you will get the slides after the presentation. So don't be concerned if you can't really read it very well. So this is the chapter itself, 3921. The table of contents hasn't changed at all, so there's nothing been added in this, but some of the content has changed within the section or within the chapter. But the general brief has stayed the same, the general guidance. Illustrations must communicate in a simple and clear and economical way. They need to visually enhance the technical information that's written. but for the user to perform an intended task. And it needs to be prepared in accordance with the text. So pretty standard technical documentation rules that you would do to support your written information. The presentation format is advised to be portrait, and if there's going to be fold-outs on landscape orientations, then they need to be defined in the project business rules. Of course, if you're only delivering an IETP or ITM, then there's no really rule on it needs to be portrait, for instance. This is more what your capability of your IETP is, or ITM, in the viewer of the actual illustration. So although there's guidance, this is more if you're actually printing the illustration. If it's going into some kind of book form, then portrait is the preferred format. The next part here is around like general rules. This is on the right. You see the 4.1 page. And we'll just go through these in order, but we'll show you the 4.2 and how that's changed in a second. So we're looking for consistent illustration appearance. So line weights, line styles, annotations, symbols, perspective projection really needs to be isometric. And I think the majority of illustrations out there are isometric nowadays. And the illustration and page size. So I don't know, you can see on the right that it shows the illustration itself with some guidance, but it also below that it shows you the line weights associated with that, and even the annotations and item numbers, the actual text. Now in 4.2, they've now gone, and all we have is the illustration with general guidance on center lines and illustration items. So forth. So you'll see in a second that they've been separated out into tables. So the information needs to be clear and concise, extraneous data removed. Usually it would be monochrome, so a black and white illustration, but you can use color. The spec doesn't prevent you using color, but it says really use it for clarity. And this is the first real business rules decision point, or BRDP. Do you use color in your final deliverable? So that is a project decision and one that will be made really at the beginning. So in 4.1, we just had a paragraph about line weights, typefaces, and type sizes. And here we have this. Now have added in again something around a legacy. So if scaling of an illustration is required to fit a legacy illustration into an S1000D illustration reproduction area, then it needs to be scaled proportionally. Again, bit common sense that you wouldn't really do it disproportionately, but the saying that it needs to be proportion, not just scale it to a particular area and distort it. So the line weights now have been separated out into a table. There was one table in 4.1 that associated back to that illustration that guidance I showed you on the last slide. But now in 4.2, what we have is a whole raft, a table really, that they've separated out from the illustration. Now the difference is that they've given now pens types. So we got type 1 is solid, type 2 dash, type 3 dot, and type 4 dash dot. And they've given you guidance on how they should be represented. And then you can see on the right hand table that the line type is on the far right of the table, and then the illustration items say are from 0.18 millimeter pen to 0.35. So instead of being all on that one illustration, that one page, they've now separated these out into tables. I've not been able really to see that there's really any difference between them. The guidance still seems to be the same about the line weight. They're now just defining pens as types. That seems to be the main difference here. So it shouldn't really affect anything you've done already, which is the good news. With text, in 4.1, we just had a simple paragraph on text and text style. In 4.2, we got the same paragraph, but now we have, again, as before with the line weights, we've got a whole raft of typefaces with dimensions, callouts, the recommended type, size, 8-point, 10-point, and this goes down to item numbers, notes, legends. So they've really defined it much more tightly, the actual type, the text size of the that needs to go on an illustration. And there's also now a business rules decision point around that, but it's really to do with using, if you're going to use text on an illustration, are you going to use just uppercase, or are you going to use sentence case and lowercase? So that is something you would probably need to document in your business rules, if you're going to use capitals or not. Symbols, in 4.1, they had a few symbols actually drawn out for you. Now they've created a whole raft of symbols for virtually every direction that you could possibly go in. So this is in the new 4.2 spec. I've got a picture of them just zoomed in a bit here, so you can see that the arrowhead is clearly defined, its line weight, text size, and everything on here. Next section is color and the use of color. We won't really talk about photographs today, but the main addition to this section is the use of color in 3D content. And this, I think the people behind the spec see the use of 3D data in publications actually expanding and being more in use more. So they're trying to put some guidelines down for the spec for you to use if 3D is something you're going to be using in the future or today. So if your decision was to use color, then there's a specific color palette, which we'll see in a second, that the spec clearly defines the colors you should use for if you're filling objects perhaps or parts. There's some really good examples in the spec. I can't show them all today, but if you go to the specification, there's some very, very good examples on the use of color. Usually we'd use it to perhaps denote a hierarchical structure to the illustration. On the right here, you see that the light blue parts on this illustration are the parts, and then where the arrows are, again, sorry I can't zoom in, but the gray parts on here are parts that are shown on subsequent illustrations. In other words, that A, B, and A on there are navigational points that might take you to another illustration with that particular part on. So I recommend, if you're using color, to follow those guidelines, look at the spec and follow those guidelines as best you can, and use the colors that they specify. So on here, the 4.1, they have these blocks with the text inside, with the RGB, CMYK, and in 4.2, they've kind of smartened this up. I think this is a lot better guidance, really. It is the same. I've gone through it, and it is the same guidance. There's no new colors, and they haven't changed the colors in any way. So it's just a replica, but it's just done in a different way, and I think it's a bit easier to read. Where you've got RGB, CMYK, and Pantone in. It's more of a table type view, so a lot easier to follow. And these are the recommended colors that you should be using as part of the spec. So this is the new section, use of color in 3D content. They do say that you should try and adhere to the S1000D color palette if you're coloring 3D objects. Projects should define a color scheme for the whole program. So this would be kind of, again, common sense, that if you're going to use certain colors, then it should be for the whole program or project. They're also saying for 3D that you should define devices, viewers capable of displaying the data, which again is pretty much common sense. If if you've got a device, if you've got a large 3D file, then the device needs to be suitable to view that data, and also the viewers that you're using. So also consider the capabilities of the technology. So is the technology using capable of viewing this information? You need to really send out clear guidelines to the users to make sure they can view the information. Again, use color consistently. The color red should only be used for warnings, and they're saying the color amber should only be used for cautions. I'm thinking that was a mistake, and it should be yellow, not amber, for a caution. That's when I read the spec. The color rules do not apply to realistically rendered surfaces. So if you think that makes sense in the respect of if you've got a 3D model that's been rendered as the actual equipment itself, then you can't really re-render that and use different colors. So and also the same would apply to photograph. If you've got a color photograph, you wouldn't color that in and try and match the spec. So if it's realistic, then you can really have any color that you want. The specification also encourages a gradient color for the background of 3D data or 3D images. So they feel that gives a better impression of the item. And also, if you've got a 3D model, then it really needs to be supported with symbols and markings and wording for critical information situations. So if it's a procedure that you're showing, then you still need to use symbols and markings that are applicable to that equipment and that procedure. So some of the things that I've just covered are also in this section as well. This section really hasn't changed that much, and that's the use of interactive 3D content. So there's quite a long section here, but I've really taken out the main things that I think are of interest. It really provides basic guidelines for 3D interactive graphics. The production of 3D content, again, common sense. It must be produced from verified and authoritative engineering information. So, I don't think any project would use information that's not been verified. 3D information usage. I would really see this used where procedures are complex, where you can raise a business case to actually include that 3D data, because that can be an added expense actually creating it, but also then your IETP or your delivery mechanism has to support that as well. So that could be an added cost to support another viewer within the IATM. So things that you need to think about probably before using 3D. And again, as I mentioned before, it needs to include appropriate warnings and cautions where parts are removed. I was expecting in the 4.2 that they would actually recommend a file format for 3D delivery. There is nothing on the file format itself. A personal comment: this is not the spec. The project should seriously consider specifying a 3D file format, and probably put this as a business rule. The main reason I say that is because there are so many different 3D file formats, so many different ways of viewing that information. And my advice would be to try and go on use an open 3D format, which there are, again, quite a few of them. And then you will be able to standardize on a viewer and the way that data is presented, and the users will find it much more easy to kind of view the data if it's in a standard form. So the next section is identifying, and here we come to the ICN, or information control number. This section has not changed. I probably wouldn't expect it to change because of the implications if it did. But from a project point of view, as we all know, data modules are assigned a unique code. Multimedia objects, including illustrations, also require their own unique ICN code. The presentation of that code really needs to be, you need to take a decision, another business rule here. Should it be presented on the presentation or the display of the graphic? In my experience, it usually is, but it probably depends on the object itself. So say if it's a video, then that might be more difficult, and it's part of an IETP. That might be difficult to show, but it could be actually shown outside the frame rather than on the illustration or the object itself. But that's a decision you have to make. Do you display it or not? If it's an illustration, it's usually displayed in the lower right-hand corner. That is the guidance. Finally, on the ICN code, that it can be used in multiple data modules and keep the same code. So if you're using it in a different data module, then you don't have to change the code for that different data module. You can keep the same code. Now there's two options for coding the object, the graphic object or multimedia object or illustration. There's the cage code, which is is quite simple, and then there's the model identification code structure. Again, this is a decision point, again, which one you use. I've got to be honest, I've never seen anybody use a cage-based coding as yet. So it's very simple. It's really just based on the originator of the information, so it's not project specific. The ICN that's based on the model identification code is very similar to the data module code, and probably would make more sense because then you can keep a similar coding structure for your graphic objects as you do for your data modules. And a lot of this would be replicated as well in relationship and also with the associated data module. So the prefix is also always ICN, that's the way you identified it, and then you use the same model identification code as your data module, and so on. So there'll be a lot of replication here, so it should be quite easy to code your ICNs. The main body of work would be, if you're on a new project, is actually coding your data modules themselves, which then should flow down to your graphics. So at this point, I'm just going to bring up a graphic. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Is that we have an S1000D illustration. I'm just going to zoom in on this particular area. So you can see here the decision was made to use uppercase, not numbers. So it's more descriptive for this particular illustration. Line weights, I've noticed that this has probably come from another piece of software. And we can see this darker or thicker line is 0.347, so it was obviously a 3.5, but we've had some kind of, it might have been in the export that it's not done with the accuracy turned on, and also with the 0.18, it's now 0.1799, so it's very, very close, but it's obviously not quite 0.18. But it would probably pass. There's no, in my experience, there's no real way of validating this other than actually looking at the file itself. There's no kind of validation process you could go through other than opening the file and looking at it. But I would say they're obviously close enough. They're within a margin of error. And here we can see the color that's been used, that light blue, that cyan color, and obviously the color on the detail here, this navigation, which we didn't cover in this particular part one. We'll cover in part two. This color, this blue color for the details. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. The final part is managing, and this is a brand new chapter, 3927, and this is the ICN Metadata File. So what is an IMF? Well, it's an XML file, similar in structure to a data module, but it's an external file to the to the object itself, or to the graphic, or to the multimedia object. You could call it an XML companion file because it is a companion to the graphic. You would need to, if you're going to manage this information, and I'll go into more depth of what it contains in a second. This is more designed, this file's designed to go into a CSDB, a common source database, for managing the illustrations at a much kind of granular level. But the thing is that the CSDB would need to support this because it's not something that they would have off the shelf. It's something they would need to implement into the CSDB. And I would assume most vendors will do this. It wouldn't be, well, I'm speaking out of turn probably, but I don't see it being a major task to put this new file type in. The IMF it's linked to the illustration via the ICN code. So that this is where the ICN, I wanted to cover that first, that unique code is the link between the IMF and the graphic itself. So it really presents the opportunity to store metadata outside of the graphic. From what I can read, what I've read so far, the use of it is optional. There is no business rule associated with it in the chapter that I found. So the use of it is optional. And probably something you wouldn't use retrospectively on an older project unless you see a major benefit. But in new projects, then I would probably look at it as a good way of managing your data, or your graphic data. Just a warning is that it's not a data module document type. It's not a new data module type. So what does it look like? Every file is prefixed with IMF. So this again differentiates it, ICN, DMC. It's got a new prefix. The overall structure is quite simple, and it is similar to a data module. So it has an ID and status field or section, and then it has a content section. So in actual, in terms of a data module, it is similar. So as we go down further, it's got the IMF, it's got the address and status, and then the content below that. And this is where it kind of begins to differ a bit from a data module. We can see, I could just put my arrow over here. They got the code, which is the ICN code, which is the link to the graphic itself. Then we got the issue number, invert number. So this is granularity we didn't have, or we can't have usually within the file name, perhaps, of the ICN. Or we could contain it externally. And then we've got the title of the file, its issue date. Certainly, this is certainly something that wouldn't be in the ICN code, which was the only way we have identifying it at the moment. And then you can add keywords to the IMF, which means that within the CSDB you could actually do searches based on in these keywords here. And these are all, interestingly, things like applicability, perhaps Mark 1, Mark 9. I haven't found an applicability element within it, so this would be a good way of perhaps defining applicability of the illustration or the graphic. The status section I see really as more like a boilerplate content from the data module itself, because it's all about data restrictions and security. So that would really flow down from the data module. So you could almost create a template for this file, which would have the standard things in, and then the unique you would add for that particular graphic. So perhaps the overhead isn't as great as it might seem initially. The content section contains this ICN variation element, and there can be multiple instances of this. The first attribute is the notation or the type of file that it is. In this case, it's CGM. But interestingly, this is the interesting part for me anyway, is that the IMF file can also contain hotspot information external to the graphic, which might be a much easier way of managing it than actually in the graphic itself. Thoughts on this? The CGM viewer that you're using would need to support this file format, which is obviously possible. And in theory, the viewer could also display ID and status information about the graphic as well, a bit like a data module. So this could be very useful for users to get further information on the actual graphic. We can see below that this ICN object element contains the ID of the hotspot in this case, and say for instance the object title is the tooltip. So you can see all the information that you would usually associate with displaying a CGM is contained in this file. And the attribute could also be used for 3D graphics as well. Again, the viewer would have to support that. And below that we have some more elements. This is interesting in the respect that you could also have references to different viewports within, or viewpoints within the graphic inside the IMF. Also references to data modules and catalog sequence numbers. So if you go into a specific part in an illustrated parts data. So, and this is all standard linking. So you'd actually put in the DM ref as you would do in a data module. So it's almost like having a data module for your graphic in some respects. And then we could also have it could also have links to source files, so source material, important that for the creation of that data, and reference information. So there's a lot of granularity here of what you can add to the information about the graphic. And finally, the code itself. So there's actually a code for the ICN, sorry, the IMF, and that's derived really from the ICM. So perhaps the only difference will be that you'll have a prefix of IMF. So again, we're flowing down from the data module to the ICN and to the IMF. So the main body of work will be done when you're doing, if you've got a new project, is creating that data module code. So a quick demo on that. These are very short demos today, so I apologize for that. So the first thing is I'm going to go to the S1000D bike. Now we have, this is VisX Edit, and we have the ability to export an XML companion file. So this was laid out, this structure was laid out in the web CGM specification. So it's in the CGM spec, not in the S1000D spec. So this is quite straightforward to create. And I've got it opened here already in the in Notepad. So you can see here, this is what it actually exports. So my thought is that if we could probably export the beginnings of an IMF from within the illustration package, so using the same element. So creating that XML file from within the illustration software. So if I look at the IMF now, so this is the XML we're looking at, and we can see that the different fields, the address field that we were looking at in the screenshot. So there's the code, the issue number. Here's these keywords, ICN keywords, so mountain byte. So these could be applicable to, obviously, to your project, the title of the file. So let's just close that down. And then we have the status, which I think is pretty much boilerplate because you've got export restrictions. So again, these should really flow down from your data modules like copyright and so forth. So these should be pretty standard things that you could just have a template for. So it shouldn't be too much of a challenge once you've done one. And then we have the content, and here we see those hotspots. So you could see that we had, it's not the same as the XML companion file. So there's a bit more detail in here. We got the tooltips, obviously, and you can also have coordinates in here as well as an attribute. So the coordinates, as with the companion file, the coordinates could be, there's an attribute for that as well within here as well. Okay, so let's just get back to the presentation. So in summary, I think we covered those three main sections. I don't think it's not changed substantially, which is good. Respect to illustration creation, I think some of the changes are mainly cosmetic and are useful because it's easier to follow. There's more guidance around using legacy, but again, the project will have to determine what legacy it uses because of cost and so forth. As long as the illustrations are consistent, I think that will be the main thing. There's some additional guidance around the use of 3D, especially color. Surprisingly to me, no 3D file format has been specified. Certainly an open format I would have expected. So you've really got to think about, could this cause issues around interoperability between projects if you're working with other companies? You know, have they got similar software? And also the display of data, you're going to have to choose a viewer. And there's a lot of 3D viewers out there, so there could be, unfortunately, a plethora of viewers all vying, perhaps even within the same IETP for different types of 3D data. So that could be a bit of a minefield. And then we had the introduction of the IMF with all its data management benefits and also metadata benefits for displaying within the publication itself. On the flip side, I think it's a good thing, but on the flip side, it's going to add a preparation overhead. There's no guidance from the specification if it's optional or a requirement, so I think it must be optional. And it will probably be a project decision if you adopt IMF or not. And also, obviously, your software needs to be updated to support IMF as well. So that's obviously a decision that would be taken around the capabilities of the software that you have. So at this point, to see if we have any questions. We've got a few questions. Do I believe, this is obviously topical because it was the last thing I covered, do I believe the IMF will be adopted? I think it probably will by some projects that need to have that granularity of control over the graphic objects, but obviously the software needs to be updated to support that as well. Is there a way of validating illustration content? There was some software I saw some years ago, or a few years ago, that was able to do it, but that seems to be no longer available. So I've not heard of anything since. Obviously, the validation would probably be done through some QA internally. So it will be validated, but not kind of in a machine type way. I'm not quite sure what this question is about, but I think, are the specification illustrations available? Things like the symbols and so forth. I don't believe they are, but I think it'd be useful if they were made available, because it could be good guidance. Like somebody actually mentions the S1000D mountain bike, wishing it a happy 15th birthday, because it has been around quite a long time. Ironically, the bike isn't really probably a good example of illustrations in documentation because there's no real isometric in there. So I think it'd be good if the organization released, say, the symbols and so forth, because they're obviously illustrations. So it'd be good if they released those, and they would provide really good guidance, I think, for projects. And finally, there is applicability included in the IMF, the applicability model. Not that I've seen. I think it would be quite a complex thing to include. And I think that's why the keywords are there, from my opinion anyway, which I did mention earlier. So I think the keyword, the applicability model, it's obviously very complex and not in the IMF that I found. So keywords could be a good alternative. So I think that's it for the questions. Thank you for those. Thank you for attending today. The next webinar, part 2, will be on August 15th. Hope you can attend. We'll be covering some of the sections that I didn't cover today, but also a focus on illustration formats, CGM and SVG. We'll also communicate some work we've been doing, and we'll be publishing a paper around SVG, tech SVG. We're trying to kind of standardize that particular format for this market. So, and that's standardized in respect to interoperability of SVG. So I think you'll find that part very interesting. Our next event is the S1000D user forum, and this is our kind of a build up to that in New Orleans. So we'll have a booth there. Registration is open if you can attend. If you're already attending, we'll look forward to meeting you there. And don't worry about those links. They'll be part of the slide pack, and also we'll be sending out invitations to those as well. So I don't think there's any more questions. So I'd just like to thank everybody for attending today. If you do have any questions that you think of post-webinar, please send them to us. So have a great day, and we'll hopefully see you at the next webinar or in New Orleans. Thank you.